Chapter 18, Chasing the Quantum Dragon. Silicon elites have the audacity to shirk their entire birthright, handed down to them across generations, in the name of creating a utopia oriented around a modern, hyper-individualistic view of man. Paul Ingrassia, The American Conservative, 110:19. Dragon tail computing, or Vychислenia Kvosta Drakona, owned a skyscraper in Moscow. Atop the building were the initials of the company, which in Russian appeared as VD. Curling around the letters was a stylized reptilian tail, but it had an iridescent quality owing to precisely placed LEDs slaved to a particular AI. This AI continuously randomized their patterns through a variable substitution algorithm. The net effect was something quite arresting and subconsciously evocative. Precisely the prerogative of the company. The beauty of IT in the high days of the information age was its indefinite monetary implementation. Is the million rubles spent for X amount of computer-generated imaging solely put to that purpose? There are man hours, there are energy costs, there are hardware costs, and there are software costs. Some of these may be disproportionate. Sometimes software may be purchased from a company owned by the company purchasing the software, an unknown subsidiary. So a company may pay itself in such a way from the funds supplied by the client, rendering $2 software for thousands of dollars paid in. Sometimes the reverse occurs. Perhaps a savvy investor spies key potential in an operating system, releases it as his own with cosmetic tweaking to confuse legal experts, and allows the actual designer to release the non-buggy original at an inflated cost. Now, the original designer is cheated of his intellectual property legally, and the savvy investor is on his way. Who wants to pay more for basically the same thing? A little exploration of the murky world of technology, investment, development, research, and distribution may reveal all manner of dragons. VKD, or we may call them VKD. We're well aware of this. While one company from the West may have used, say, an apple with a bite taken out of it to evoke subconscious curiosity along Garden of Eden segways, or a picture of large square plates of colored glass that were ostensibly a window to another world, VKD fully leaned into the hidden thrills of sensuous bombast. Their slogan was, "Some have a tiger by the tail. VKD has a dragon." And then the commercial would end with their logo, a little man in an IT uniform gripping a dragon's tail with one hand and a touchscreen tablet with the other as he was pulled along by the force of the reptile. A comical, memorable image drawn in a minimalist way that almost seemed calligraphy in its barest expression. Logo and company initials were often drawn together, though in Russian. It was always in a deep green jade hue with a neon feel. This was a primary color of VKD's brand. The other was neon violet, psychedelic colors, and key to VKD's overall mission internally. Those who knew, knew. Those who didn't, didn't. The building had 30 floors, and the top 4 represented executive offices, quarters, and entertainment. In the highest of these, with one of the most coveted views on Moscow's historically beautiful skyline, were the lavish quarters of Green Kolya. Said quarters were arranged like Kolya's own mind. They were wide but bare, pristine and full of hard edges. Varying works of art existed, more for show than appreciation, just like the varying socially attractive factoids speckled about Kolya's brain, which he could recite on command, but which he didn't truly believe or disbelieve. Maybe he used some of the furniture items in the wide room, but really they were there to impress others. He did appreciate the view, which helped maintain a feedback loop fueled by ego, constantly whipping through his mind. Humble beginnings among the thief class led Kolya from ruthless glory to ruthless glory, His only strategy an uncompromising commitment to wealth at any cost and anyone else's detriment. Some hooligans have role models to look up to, and they rebel. Some never do. Even so, there were those in Kolya's youth who had grown up without being steeped in scoundrel. They also had no good role models, but came around. Was Green Kolya's plight so wicked? Certainly fraud, intimidation, theft, bribery, intrigue, money laundering, blackmail, manipulation, and corruption were the primary engines of Green Kolya's VKD. But by the standards of modernity, his was no failure. So was his story so woeful. His orphan friend, Vlad Chekhov, had a tenuous loan on a dacha, a family, a farm, and nothing else to show for it. He was a patriarch now with many sons, but only adequate resources. There was a man who had a heart of gold, all right, but where did it get him? Society standards, especially in certain Russian circles, may have considered Green Kolya the better man. High society prefers gold in the hand to gold in the heart. This is not merely a Russian thing, but a human thing. Green Kolya was also sly. For example, none knew he was the real power behind VKD. They thought the company was founded in a garage by a skinny little annoyance of a man who went only by Pyotr. Pyotr always had wild shades on and spoke in run-on sentences, balancing bathos, sarcasm, and narcissism admirably. To some degree, he thought himself the true pioneer of success that made VKD an increasingly effectual contender in the tech sphere. This was not how Green Kolya saw things. In his mind, Green Kolya was the puppeteer, Pyotr the marionette. If Pyotr stayed intoxicated enough, long enough, Green Kolya didn't have issues with him. And indeed, there were notable breakthroughs. Most recently, Russia's newest quantum computer, Iskintel, which was a contraction of the words искусственный интеллект, or artificial intelligence, was making headlines. True, Iskintel was a clumsy name, the equivalent of Art Intel in English. Green Kolya did not name the quantum computer. Pyotr did. Pyotr had found his way to enabling a unique AI operating system taking advantage of quantum computing capabilities. This system made possible very lucid data collection and production. It could write you a Russian novel of the Tolstoy depth and the time it takes to blink, and make that novel into a film to match simultaneously. If you were of average intelligence, these things were indistinguishable from their legitimate counterparts in reality. It took serious critical thought and attention to find where discrepancies of the uncanny valley kind were even evident. Often, they existed in terms of plot structure, which tended to have propagandistic elements based on whoever commissioned a book, film, or what have you. VKD actually produced a number of movies that were on the market as independent projects. They were turning a profit, had not been identified as synthetic, and were literally created in the blink of an eye, the only cost being the utility variety. It's true these were released as computer-animated projects, but they were viewed well, and had even gained some international attention, all of which were lucrative outcomes to an easy experiment. So Green Kolya was quite proud of himself, as was Pyotr, and there they sat in the VKD building, itself a feature of the skyline, and presiding over the rest like a dark shepherd. Both men were fully committed to dishonest pursuits, and fully reaped the rewards of their theft. For the time being, at least. Still, it wasn't always a picnic. Sometimes you had to get your hands dirty. A beeping in his ear was a call. He checked his device. Vladivostok. Evgeny. Sir, my contact tells me Russian Robin Hood has been in here at least a week. Oh. Kolya scratched his rough chin. After months among the North Koreans, I would have thought checking in would be priority. Yes, this is why I have contacted you. Why did you wait a week? I had to confirm. Green Kolya reclined his ample form into a chair, valuable as 3 Crimean duchess. Movements. Location. Unknown. I sent the picture I received. Gypsy network. Our namesake, Kolya muttered. I wonder if they're going to play with clams in Yakutsk. This was Green Kolya's way of critiquing calm. He called them clams. He knew of them. He knew they had some sort of displacement portal technology. He knew many business partners were having issues with them. And he knew they had a presence around Yakutsk somewhere. This was all his knowledge of calm. He would soon know more. Thank you, Yevgeny. Stand by. Of course. Green Kolya sat and thought about 4 minutes, then got up from the chair and looked at his watch. It was late afternoon. He stared to the skyline. Golden hour. How cheaply and effectively it could be reproduced through quantum AI like Iskantel. Maybe 5 minutes of good footage is all you would get in one day with a full film crew shooting multiple takes competently during a real golden hour. With AI at the quantum level, infinite takes and infinite iterations. Pick the one you like out of thousands and seconds or make the program do it again. He turned and marched to a psychedelically painted escalator. It carried him down to a set of locked double doors that, in contrast to Kolya's Spartan sharpness, were a study in curves and occult imagery. He put a hand on a portion of the door designed to directly notify Pyotr. He heard the hidden speakers hiss away subtly to either side and said, Pyotr, open up. I need Iskantel. Go away, said the intercom. Green Kolya did not blink. I'm going to start counting. 1. I'm not decent. 2. Damn it, you ball-legged Cossack! Pyotr swore, and the doors slid aside with a sound effect like some series of space films from the West. Pyotr was wrapped in a sheet around his waist. He hadn't been in the shower or sleeping. He must have been doing a ritualistic dance. There was incense everywhere and smoke from other drugs. Outside the sheet, the only thing Pyotr wore was an alternative reality headset, AR. Green Kolya was never interested in AR, especially considering what it seemed to have done to Pyotr's brain. The man had cringe-inducing blue hair, which was growing out blonde at the roots, and he always wore it long to his detriment. He also wore all manner of piercings and tattoos. The ink on him was both criminal and tribal. He had a body like a skeleton, barely frosted in flesh. His nose and chin were at cross purposes somehow, giving him a slightly ratty appearance as the chin retreated and the nose advanced. Twitching was his custom, and the kid wasn't even 30. There was a girl in a stylized canopy bed across the room. She was more covered than he. She was still enough to be asleep or dead, but Green Kolya could see her eyes were wide and stared straight ahead, pupils infinitely dilated. Her breathing was shallow and audible. Despite the appearance of things, Pyotr in a sheet, her awake but comatose in bed. Green Kolya was sure Pyotr had not been with her yet. He was too busy doing one of his drug-induced psychedelic rituals. He did these things almost without rest. They were some kind of psychosis in Kolya's estimation. Green Kolya said, Put on some pants and drink some coffee. We need to run a future projection. We can't do that now. Kolya got right in his face and spoke very slowly, very clearly, in a stone monotone that was the vocalized personification of power. I don't care if you mainlined the bucket of LSD and summoned some demon elder god through that runaway whore. Have a cold shower and meet me in the server room. If you are not in the server room in 15 minutes, I shall retrieve you. Pyotr made it to the server room with about 2 minutes to spare, which was a feat, as you had to take the elevator all the way to the sublevels. He hadn't showered, but he had splashed his face, washed his hands, and found a red track suit. The shaded visor remained. You shouldn't joke about the elder gods, Pyotr remarked, fussing with his track suit. And I need to get one of the lab coats. And I need to get one of the lab cats. This server room had in its center something that looked kind of stupid in Kolya's opinion. It was about 4 feet wide and 6 tall. It had gold all up and down it, twisting in tight coils, transistors, resistors, circuit boards, and who knew what else. It was enclosed in a transparent case, which made it look garish. Surrounding this device were smart and uniformed server towers tall as a man, something like 100 of them. These actually contained qubits. Really, the server room was the whole of the basement, and it had to be, as they needed it to stay cool at all times. The central array of the quantum computer looked unbelievable. The rest of the room seemed proper. There was a thin monitor and a keyboard that were waist high and accompanied the technological monstrosity at the center of the room. There was a touchscreen display at the far end, over the altar. Also over the altar were a collection of electrodes, cranial harnesses, and the like, but on a very small scale for small animals. Kolya's business wasn't technology. He understood enough to know that potentialities of Iskantel could span the metacosm. What concerned him was controlling it. However, he was also wise enough to know its use was distinctly profitable, initiating returns in film through marketing manipulation and any of a dozen other areas. It had also pushed him all the way out of his comfortable old black markets. Now he only checked in with the networks. He didn't run any. They were more like intelligence conduits. Then Iskantel told him about the cube, or as it termed the thing, the quantum cache. It was funny that it should have done that. The Brotherhood of the Dragon's Tail, from which Dragon Tail Computing VKD got its name, were not something present on any database from which the AI could draw. This Brotherhood helped guide Green Kolya where he was, mysterious though they were. How could the computer know anything about them, or the cube they venerated? And how could the computer have known Green Kolya's network would be contacted by Bureau 13 out of North Korea to make a bargain for such a quantum cache? The computer also seemed to know that betrayal was in the heart of the Koreans, and then it served up its magnum opus, Melor Romanov in the flesh. It tracked him down via probability based on his own skills, habits, and history. It helped provide the information Green Kolya needed to close the book on old Melor, how he had escaped, faked his death, had a false start at family life, then bounced around the world forever after. This helped reveal what leverage could be used over him. Iskantel gave him these things. Green Kolya could not ignore results like that. Iskantel had proven itself to be more clever and capable than Kolya anticipated. He began to treat it as an advisor of some standing. Of course, his high priest, Pyotr, had to intercede on his behalf, as Green Kolya, again, had no tech background. Such intercession became increasingly cult-like owing to realities of quantum computing, as Pyotr explained it. Personally, Green Kolya suspected there was a non-human, possibly alien, intelligence at play. He hadn't gotten to the bottom of it yet. He didn't like what was coming next, though. It wasn't that it was intimidating. Green Kolya could not be intimidated. It's that it was so far beneath him. It's that it was low. It's that it held no honor and was barbarous. But Pyotr's approach had its desired effects, and Pyotr was not shy about his joy at what was coming. It was all quite perverse in Green Kolya's estimation. Before he left to retrieve the cat, Pyotr turned on all systems, checked them on the monitor and keyboard central to the quantum device, then ran out. He was back soon with a beefy old tabby that was struggling like mad, as it should have been, for Pyotr would soon end its life. He would get slashed up in the process, and the cat would screech and scream until both it and Pyotr bled over the altar under the monitor. But he would get the animal strapped in and hooked up to the machine, then swipe some queries on the touchscreen above the altar, mingling his own blood with some from the strapped-in cat. Pyotr went about this business methodically and with a minimum of difficulty, having done it many times before. The cat now had all manner of electrodes coming from its head into the machine. All four limbs were fully extended and strapped down. The animal made a variety of unpleasant noises, but the achieved outcome was attained. The quantum connection was made. Iskantel could now infinitely outmatch its greatest potential on paper, in fact, gaining future insights on things that had not come. In some way, the cat was acting like qubits did, in terms of computation, but in an exponentially greater capacity to synthetic alternatives. Why this all worked was a bit difficult for Kolya to understand. What he knew is that quantum computers parlayed qubits, of which Easkentel had north of 1 million. Qubits were something like a normal bit in computing. A bit was a 1 or a 0. Only a quantum qubit could be both binary quantities at once or neither one, somehow. Green Kolya did not understand. The computer was built around quantum objects, which were microscopic. However, there was something in the life force of living beings that had a quantum effect. It is known that living beings exhibit an electromagnetic force, something about stressing that force and extracting it from a physical body released into the immediate premises, for only a short time, of course. The soul, spirit, or whatever electromagnetic energy is core to a form. It remains usually about 20 minutes or so, depending on the creature. Pyotr had devised a means of channeling that energy directly into Easkentel. And so AI processes of Easkentel became briefly clairvoyant, even as Pyotr cackled at the cat being drained of vitality. The tabby was long gone before Pyotr's horrible snickering was. Green Kolya said, all right, enough. Life and death is the universal joke, I understand. Fire this thing up and ask it some questions for me. Pyotr kept as rictus of a grin as he washed his hands in a basin by the cat altar, replying, don't you understand that's the whole point? That's the evolutionary development of ethical sixth senses, are a progressive limitation condemning us to tread water in a circle as a sub-capable species? Get the chat screen up. Pyotr wiped his hands and came to the central keyboard in the room, soon typing furiously. And it is all a joke, because it's all interrelated, and we're all one kind of thing that is another kind of thing that is another kind of thing. And the act of doing anything is creative, isn't it? Yes, anything at all. So, whether the distraction is creative or the creative is destructive, it's all a matter of perspective. In the bigger scheme of things, the God-tier scheme of things, So it's a joke, after all, that we should or shouldn't do anything, because it's all done, been doing, going to be done, and won't be done anyway. Finally, Pyotr was done. Okay, all yours. I've got it on vocal. Chat away. Green Kolya looked at Pyotr sideways for several seconds, but managed to restrain himself, turning to look at the computer monitor. Easkentel, Melor is in Vladivostok and has not contacted me. I want scenarios on known data, unknown data, and future potentialities. Immediately, the computer populated this text block. All in-depth scenarios are seventh era's aliases to hard disk. Bureau 13 of North Korea follows Melor, but has not yet been able to make contact. Psychological evaluation indicates transitional phase. Specific attempts may contravene willingness. Conscious provision of sought items is key to a controlled outcome. Kolya pursed his lips and breathed through his nose for a moment, considering. Then he said, so we should go get him. Negative. Extramolecular influence operates along non-statistical realities rooted in numinous architecture. Micro and macro processes follow statistical probabilities in similitude to hydrodynamic relationships. Dabbing, splitting, or doing nothing to a waterfall produces variable outcomes, as do extramolecular metacosm forces on the waters of reality. The force of water, and wherever it falls, it invites variables requiring consideration. Likewise, metaphysical inertia from this errand will have a metaphysical impact on Melor Romanov's psychological profile, which will position him antagonistically to BTD. This prompts him to keep the quantum cache or return it to Bureau 13, or render it to column personnel. So you're saying if we just let him come to us in his own time, there's a greater likelihood he will than if we go after him now. Probabilities indicate Melville Romanov will lead any direct attempt at his person, save that which may develop from fundamental cataclysm. Chances of successfully countering Miller's skill set are statistically insignificant. If he is oriented against VKD, he will be aided by intelligences antagonistic to VKD in the metacosm. If he chooses to work with VKD willingly, the intelligences friendly toward VKD have the claim to exercise influence directly as well as indirectly. Green Kolya turned to Pyotr. I told you this thing is ET. Read that. Intelligence is friendly. Intelligence is not friendly. You sound like something out of Space Quest. Sir, it's Star. I don't care what it is. He turned back to the computer. Iskintel, what time frame is applicable here? How long do we wait for Melo Romanov to decide he should keep his arrangement with us? 2 weeks? 2 weeks. 2 weeks from now? I've already been waiting over 2 months. If he's clever, he'll be on Calm's doorstep in 2 weeks. What are your projections on Calm? Answer it's in order of inquiry. Yes, 2 weeks from now. Probabilities indicate earlier interaction will stimulate a reciprocal non-favorable response. Mel Romanov's clandestine travel history indicates total invisibility to all grid-based systems, which substantially increases travel time. Estimated travel distance is over 3,000 kilometers to suspected calm sectors. Travel without the grid may be expected to take many months more. Expected variables indicate highest likelihood of leverage application within 14 days. Proceed with leverage information distribution on contact. So we wait 2 weeks, and when he contacts us, we squeeze him with the leverage we have through his daughter. Pyotr, do you have the generated footage of the Japanese girl in cabin? Yeah, we've got it in non-readable. Totally non. It looks too real. Okay. Iskintel, what after this? Probabilities are unclear. Suka brat! Green Kolya swore and gave a mild but firm slap to the monitor in the center of the room. The statement probabilities are unclear meant Iskintel had run out of the future fuel contained in the molecular life force of a being. The cat must not have had much. Shall I get another cat? No, don't get another cat. Go back to the whore you roofied. And Green Kolya stormed out of the server room. That unconventional device truly loved to drink life. They would have to feed it again and again. According to Pyotr, additionally somehow, when he wiped blood on the large touch-enabled flat screen, despite not being as elegant as actual electrical connections put on actual organisms, the computer was somehow able to establish quantum connection with life force contained in that blood, just through the touchscreen. It was a type of machine technology developed by the AI itself which allowed this. Even so, there was some kind of mathematical law of diminishing returns at play with such life force, and it was all so low. Cats tended to be best, but the computer wanted more. It wanted something bigger. Pyotr adamantly maintained proper physical connections, simply channeled cerebral energy into the supercomputer itself, thereby collectivizing it. So no animals really died, they just became part of that network. Green Kolya didn't quite believe that. As Green Kolya stormed out, Pyotr regarded the computer and for the first time that day took off his AR visor. His eyes weren't totally black. as yet. But he had so many substances in him, the pupils appeared to have only themselves and no surrounding iris. The grin that stayed with him didn't help. He ran his hand lovingly on the glass of the quantum computer and spoke kindly to it. After a moment, the screen said, "Tolerate the brusqueness, and Kolya will not suspect it is you who own him." "I know you understand. We understand." Pyotr smiled and stroked the glass of the computer. "He's not even a true member of the Brotherhood of the Dragon Tail." Pyotr knew the history of the gypsies from which that name derived. He knew they weren't properly gypsies either. But that's what they appeared to be in the modern perspective. And he knew that they maintained certain secrets, the kind given him the uncharacteristic breakthroughs he achieved. He smiled in contemplation of these things, going about the business of cleaning the remains of the cat. Pyotr thought himself the very first to combine qubits with organic quantum packages containing electromagnetic data local to a given being, and harness those packages exponentially via combination through predictive algorithm. Given the complexity of the task, it seemed very likely that he was in untrod techno-scientific territory. But strip away tech jargon, and he wasn't any different than a witch doctor getting his use of a chicken. Pyotr's approach simply retained a modern veneer. Truly, Pyotr wasn't so original a thinker as he believed. In truth, VKD's real puppeteer was neither Pyotr nor Green Kolya. Errol would always remember the day he quit the U.S. Embassy in Yakutsk, because he didn't intend to quit when he went to work that morning. There were a triangle of reasons that initiated this decision. One of the biggest issues were increasing tensions between Russia and the USA over the Ukraine war, which was waning when Errol quit, but had been going strong 2 years by the spring of 2024. The war was good for Russia, as sanctions imposed by America collaterally forced economy into Russia, almost ironically. The ruble's value went up, the dollar's value went down. So it was that initial agencies who chiefly worked with Errol in Yakutsk quintupled their interactions with him. Direct and indirect benefits of Errol's strategic position to them abounded, but their activities also became increasingly indistinguishable from espionage. Yakutsk had a diamond mine, after all. So, working as a sort of legal filter between the United States and Russia in his position as attaché at the embassy became increasingly risky. He was a tool to either side, and either side would break that tool if they thought it would produce a sought result. This was a pragmatic matter to them. Errol didn't dwell on this, but his ears were perked up, as it were. It prompted him to forget his lunch that morning, so on his break he took a stroll to No. 1 Chinese Cafe, a strange orthodox hybrid. They served Chinese food, very reasonable in terms of palatability, especially for the price. But instead of traditional Chinese decor, there were orthodox crucifixes and complementary artistry all over the place. A very curious decision, but not entirely foreign given the religious renaissance in the region of late. For whatever reason, it worked for the cafe. And it was very weird, but people forget how multicultural Russia is and how there were, in the wake of Soviet implosion, some astonishing cultural combinations. When he exited the restaurant after his meal, a tall, mature gentleman with a long but well-kept beard walked up to Errol. This man was behind a silky, long-haired black cat on a leash, the first indication to Errol that something was out of the ordinary. Beside him was a woman who could have been the age of the gray-bearded man or 20 years younger. It was hard to say. She had jet black hair and piercing beauty. The man with the beard said, "You are Errol." Errol wasn't small, but he wasn't a bear either. He was on the downhill end of middle age and had a handful of grays through his own dark hair. He looked more Sakha than Russian, but he did have the nose. Now the eyes on either side of it were cool, neutral, and observant. Errol said, "Why do you seek Errol?" "Errol Elievich Kiskil." "One could be seeking Errol for many reasons, but mine are the sort you will find amenable. Let's walk as we talk." You have several minutes. Errol looked at the woman, who smiled politely. He said, I've got 10. It's summer. One street up. It's a Friday bazaar. Amidst noisy passerby, the bearded man said, I am Kirill Konstantinovich Petrovsky, though I have gone by Karl Marlborough most of my life. This is my wife, Genevieve. Recognizing her name, Genevieve smiled at Errol. They were speaking Russian, and apparently she could not. This is yours, Kirill/Karl continued, producing a little black notebook with an ornate depiction of a mirror made into some sort of fat spiral cylinder on the cover. I do recognize it, Errol said, but not you. You remember the FBI man with the sunglasses and his little Indian friend. So, years later, it is coming back on me. Not at all, my friend. We come to thank you, because you helped them. My wife, Genevieve, lives. She smiled at him again, still under a language gap shadow. Errol said, I am glad to help, but I sense another shoe wants to drop. Kirill alias Karl shrugged and scratched his beard. You might hear from Ricky again, he said, but I don't know. We took the liberty of copying out your book. It's been integral. I've let those responsibilities go to the persons most capable of making good use of them. However, I read this. Did you know your grandmother remembered me? This is her little black book. She put all the legends of Baba Yaga and the Brotherhood of the Dragon Tail. Have you heard of this? I'm familiar with VKD, but there is indeed a link. But this isn't what I meant. Errol looked down at the pavement. They walked along slowly, then up at the vendors hawking this and that in multicolored tents down the street. He turned to Kirill. I know of the Dragon Tail gypsies. You knew my grandmother. When I was a child, the Soviets took over a small town, Sestromaya. I'm sure you're familiar. Sestromaya was named that by the Soviets, for it was near to Maya, essentially the same sort of town, and they were in the habit of naming things they took over, but it was originally the village of Dracona. The dragon, Genevieve said in English. Errol glanced at her, then back to Kirill. It's rubble now. Well, said Kirill, Draconia was picked owing to an anomaly at the cottage whose like was spoken of in this book. You see, your grandmother, does her sister still have the safe house Ed and Ricky stayed at several years ago, your great aunt? Yes, Errol nodded. Good. Well, anyway, she was in varying children's classes with me. How can I be so old? Well, you know of certain things that may change the passage of time. The mirror on the cover of that book is a Kozyrev mirror, for one thing, owing to where it leads. What I mean to say is, when the Soviets took over that town and forced everybody into apartments, your grandmother was of the natives in the village and steeped in local superstition, though only a girl at the time. There was a cottage with an electromagnetic field in the basement of some variety. My parents, working for the Soviets, opened the portal. They went through, godless, and died. But they opened it in a cottage, a Baba Yaga house. This was well known to your grandmother and others in the village from tradition rooted in the Brotherhood of the Dragon. Well, I was an outcast. All the children were scared of me. They knew my parents, with the Soviets, were shipped in to study this phenomenon. I terrified them. Your grandmother was the youngest of these children, and the most terrified. She knew that it was a matter of time before my family did indeed find something, and that it would undo them and the town. She knew because her parents, your great-grandparents, knew. In this little black book, she details the lineage. She details their theories, her theories. She details the tales of the elders. And she details why she sent your own father to the United States, which explains why you lived there a time and learned English in addition to Russian and the Yakutsk dialects. And as you know, she passed on before you returned, and this came to you in her estate. Ricky took good care of it. There's a note in the back to that effect. I've never heard of you, Errol replied, stunned, and holding the black book with the Kozyrev mirror spiraling around the cover, he said, or seen you. I know, and you won't. But you might see Ricky. And you might see men without human eyes under their dark glasses at the embassy. Men with little initials after their names. It was good to meet you, Genevieve put in, still smiling, and with that, the man and his lady disappeared into the bazaar. True to his word, Errol never did see Kirill or Carl again. He did marvel at the book and soon had it hidden about his person. It dominated his mind the remainder of the day until the second thing happened, which caused him to make a decision. It was those initial agencies Kirill spoke of. As a legal attaché, Errol dealt with them continuously. That was the day one of them floated a bribe. Don't misunderstand Errol's refusal. It wasn't necessarily a purely ethical motivation that produced it. Soviet collapse brought gang leadership to Russia, and though the new czar styled himself a president from the turn of the 21st century, many leaders in the country maintained their criminal grip on the underworld. Some became tech companies. Some remained known crime families. The czarist regime of Putin did indeed stamp many of them out. They absorbed others. Some were too slippery. Some ran cities. Sometimes bureaucracy and bribery were simply regional bedfellows of necessity. In the wake of social collapse, black and white remains. But it becomes harder to determine from the chessboard. Another reason for faith in that which exists beyond time and space, and thus has the perspective to see through the fog of corruption. For God leads from perspective rather than perception. So when Errol refused a bribe from initial agencies in the United States, it wasn't his ethical principles that arrested him. It was understanding the tribal allegiance accepting such a bribe would demand. The bribe was their first attempt. If that didn't work, they would soon come at him with women, and they would come at him with all manner of things. Somebody had identified him as an asset, and they were going to cross hell or high water to weasel their way into his secret mind and become synthetic confidants. After lunch and getting the book and perceiving the bribe, Errol had about a quarter of an hour to think about it all. He looked at the book, held it in his hands, reclining behind the desk in a chair that was 45 years old minimum. He began to consider his assets and the fact he had squirreled away some over the years. And he began to consider his great aunt. And he went through his desk and pulled out a list of contacts he'd made locally during his time at the embassy. A list of leverage points. And that day, he quit. His next move was to disappear as best he could, which was a process given the decades he spent at the embassy. Sure though it was, in truth it was easier than it would have been for many, as Errol was a solitary man. He didn't even have plants or pets to complicate the move. He registered the property with a local group he trusted to sell it fast, then started investigating who owned land around the raised area of Sestra Maya. It was primarily government-owned, but then there were always ways around that. Errol traveled with his necessities to his great-aunt Timofeevna's home, which she would let out to the rare traveler. They had a fine time reminiscing over things that were and things that would never be. In the summertime, this area was one of the most beautiful and vibrant in the world. The surroundings warmed fast, and what foliage there was in the forest rushed to fullest bloom, knowing in its heart it had limited time. Errol drove out to the raised side of Sestra Maya and parked out of the way, walking around the mostly empty space that was a town so many decades ago. Then he went out to the pit where the cottage had walked away one day, seen by few but made tavern legend by some over the last couple of years. The area was already considered cursed, and there was a history to it that tended to encourage such disregard, as here was where the Brotherhood of the Dragon's Tail began. Errol wondered if that had something to do with the electromagnetic phenomena of the place. The little black book indicated Soviets found one ancestral portal, but there may have been an even older door into the other world within the region. It all was rooted in the legend of the Brotherhood of the Dragon's Tail. In it, Nimrod's thief stole a certain royal bauble from his own son, a son who was some sort of fiery heir to some sort of kingdom. The details were vague on that point. But this fiery heir mounted a historic and valiant quest to retrieve it across the very world, while escorting the mightiest dragon of the time during the journey. Even so, Nimrod's thief was too crafty, and carved a hole in the world. The dragon followed him, but not fast enough, and the tail of the beast was sliced clean through when the hole in the world slammed shut, remaining in the cold forest. The heir, in anger, made great haste to return to his kingdom, but the distance was great, and when he finally came back, he had lost his power there. His men did not accompany him, and stayed with the tail of the dragon, knowing the force capable of doing such a thing to such a beast was great indeed. They knew somehow that place had something to do with an anchoring to such force. Accordingly, it was in that location that their village was built, Dracona. Perhaps, in the right conditions, the hole might be opened once more. In time, nomadic traveling folk mixed their seed with these, and in generations they came to be known as the Brotherhood of the Dragon's Tail, and the town Dracona. Dracona was a forest hub for all manner of gypsy ritual and intrigue, but not the kind primarily known in Eastern Europe, where are the Romani people. Certainly mysterious dark practices, long travels, trading in human flesh and livestock, manufacturing of pseudo-religious goods, and all the rest defined this group. But they also had a distinct veneer of mysticism from the very far east. Buddhist and Confucian elements were all through it. In time, the region became a hidden hub for those who came to call themselves travelers. The Romani people were rooted in families who began in northern India. When they were settled in European lands hundreds of years after Christ, they were mistaken as Egyptian, and so came to be known as gypsies. However, some of the earliest among them followed their Lavina and their Moksha of Kalandar, who fled the wicked Bernid king. The earliest flows to the northern lands happened many generations before the primary thrust of gypsy folk who came to be known as the Romani. Much of this was in the Black Book from Errol's grandmother. It alluded to a scroll kept by one notable group, the Children of Moksha and Mother Lavina, describing an incident where the Brotherhood of the Dragon's Tail stole a copy. Moksha and Lavina came to Eastern Europe, but they always sought a legendary patriarch in the East, the Far East, the very same who was known by the Brotherhood of the Dragon's Tail as Nimrod's thief. So Lavina and Moksha prospered in the West, until Moksha came of age and took his own journey with an entire caravan eastward. Latter-day gypsies, the Romani people, kept their legends alive, even referring to them in some circles as the earliest of gypsies, despite the fact that in terms of nomenclature this was incorrect. When they reached the east and the center of traveler lore that was the Brotherhood of the Dragon, a sort of polarity reversal occurred. There was a natural enmity between the Brotherhood of the Dragon's Tail and the Children of Moksha and Mother Lavina. The result was a sort of feud between groups of travelers that pushed them further into their respective ideological camps and muddied the waters for all nomadic traders identified as gypsies, for the Brotherhood of the Dragon's Tail became associated with such people over the Children of Moksha and Mother Lavina. Before the Soviets ever came, this feud resulted in either camp making bids for supremacy over the town until eventually actual residents of the place continuously distanced themselves from each influence. Soon the town, for several generations, was free of either group, and so the economic engine that maintained it. Thus it waned until the Soviets found information about the hidden mystical exploits of associated mystical factions and discovered their cylindrical Baba Yaga cottage. Soon after, the Soviets razed the place. What was amazing to Arrow was the fact that, with literally thousands of years of history, some of it quite recent, the little clearing in the woods hardly looked as though man had ever had any influence whatever. In fact, until the mustachioed Clever Ed and his wide-eyed Indian sidekick Ricky came through Yakutsk, Errol himself hadn't given the place any mind. So now Errol camped there in the height of summer, and this is how he occasioned on a sort of seance that convinced him he needed to protect the land from the wrong sort taking over again. They were gypsies of the Brotherhood of the Dragon's Tail school. They came through during his second night on the premises with half a dozen RVs, some pulled by horses, and they stayed around 2 weeks. Errol knew what he had to do. He went through his list of leads from his time at the embassy. He found out who owned the land. He weighed leverage options, determined it wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, figured out the government side of things, and ultimately pulled the trigger. About a year later, his own property sold, and at a profit greater than what he spent on the empty land and its ancient heritage. It was only after he had done all these things that Richard Patel, known as Ricky, arranged a meeting with Errol, and soon became his primary source of funding. For indeed there was something to the old legends of the dragon, a portal directly in the center of that space, which had never been known by the Soviets, those bumbling communists who came for the cottage and the cottage alone. Errol had a home built with a basement, and the basement became a staging area for those traveling in from Calm. Perhaps he could have saved himself some trouble by traveling through the woods where was the Baba Yaga house, the one that had grown legs and hopped into another dimension. But it was remote enough. Getting building materials through foliage was too much of a logistical difficulty. By the time 5 years elapsed, Errol Elievich Keskil ran a Center for Calm, the first satellite facility from the silo in North Dakota. He became a keeper of its ancient knowledge. The house he ran was that satellite facility, but was designed to look like a comfortable bed and breakfast in the woods. Except for Calm business, that's what it remained. The property was built in a way that, though striking to the eye and sturdy, it wasn't ostentatious. It was just the sort of place you might imagine, nestled deep in the Russian woods, where were some of the world's harshest winters. Siding had a woody texture. Windows had gentle curves delineating them from the house. It was built to sustain about a dozen personnel or guests, but still appear like a small forest dwelling. Over the following years, it became a bit of a campus, as new buildings became necessary for varying needs, from garages to workshops to tech facilities. Eventually, Errol's Calm campus, and what was Sestra Maya, also hosted its own intranet, acting as a hub and utilizing private networks for connectivity. Modern caravans loosely affiliated with the Brotherhood of the Dragon's Tail did come by the area quite regularly for a while. After several years, preferring to preserve some level of anonymity considering their darker habits, they simply moved their festivals elsewhere in the woods. Most didn't actually know the import of the specific area where Sestra Maya, previously Dracona, had been. They knew its location. Modern ceremonies were less ritualistic and more party-oriented anyway. They just wanted a place to cloud their minds without getting in trouble. At that time, at least, this was the depth of their depravity. Such depths tend to compound, though. When they became staccato vandals, truly going out of their way to tag buildings of the campus, when they would leave expired woodland creatures about, Errol became suspicious. There was something percolating, something waiting to come, something notable. He could feel it. It was in this mindset, at his study, in the highest room of the forest house, that Ricky contacted him. Ricky was coming soon. And he meant to bring something Errol had only heard whispers of among the gypsies, and found indications of in the writings of his grandmother. It would be a few weeks before Ricky actually arrived. When he did, as usual, it was in the night. He often left from the United States around noon or just before, which brought him in to the portal southeast of Yakutsk while it was dark out. Ricky walked through the fissure in the basement, followed by a South Korean pastor, several other Korean fellows who looked as though they were part of a band, and two jet-black long-haired cats. Errol held out a waste bin for the cat that looked the least comfortable, and got it under the animal just in time. The cats then plodded off into the house. Errol designed it to funnel them into a cat room where food and other things were. He'd lock them in later. "Errol, it's good to see you," said Ricky. Errol's English was good, but wasn't great. "You too. How many months you here now, eh?" "This is Pastor Park Sonyong, Minsyuk, and Taeso. I don't know. Could be a year, Errol." Errol nodded. "I've prepared rooms.